But what had begun to happen in Corinth was they had grown a bit too comfortable with one another. And in fact, had gotten so comfortable, they felt like they could really then become selfish, not really worry so much about those who had little. And this always happens in the church. As God begins to work and there begins to be a movement of the Spirit of God, guess where Satan begins to attack? He will do his best to undermine the greatest relationships in the church. He'll make those people who love one another start to doubt one another. He'll make those who often care for others become a bit selfish. He'll begin to put in those thoughts of, well, is that person really doing his or her part? Are they really pulling their weight? And I'll admit, we all are called of God to serve one another and to be our part of the body that He has designed us to be. Some are the feet, some are the hands, some are the heart, some are the back. But we're all to serve. But Satan will begin to creep in and to cause doubt and dissension. And Paul said there has to be a certain amount of faction, if you will, of division, in that some of you need to be leaders. Some of you are gifted to lead out, and there need to be those who are leading and those who are following, but there doesn't need to be all of this backbiting. But he says what's really happening is this. He said, here's the word I'm getting, and some from your church who are talking to me. Some of you are arriving early because you're probably wealthy. And you have enough food to feed yourself at home, but enough to bring to the meal. And you bring your food and you bring your drink. And rather than waiting on those who have to work longer hours and who have less to bring, maybe nothing to bring, you go ahead and eat. And by the time they get there, most of the food is gone and the good wine is gone and y'all are full and some of you are even drunk. And the poor people who are coming have nothing. He said, this is what I do not praise you about at all. Is that you are getting together in order to love one another, and there's no love. You're getting together then after the love feast to observe the Lord's Supper, and you're putting it to shame. And Paul says, I've got to address this. And so that's why we start in verse 2 of chapter 11, because Paul's call to them, I think, is the same call to us, that God's call to all of us is to remember. As we take the Lord's Supper in a few minutes. That is what Jesus has asked us to do, is to remember. That's what this weekend is about. Started in the late 1800s, Memorial Day was first called Decoration Day. And it was a time where those Civil War widows and families of those who had fallen went and decorated those graves to remember those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for their country. And through time, our country has recognized a need to show our support, our love, our reverence for those who have gone before us, those who laid down their lives for us to enjoy freedom. But what happens normally on Memorial Day? Very little remembrance and a whole lot of fellowship. Lots of food, maybe there are flags flying, and you may wear your patriotic tie, your patriotic shirt, and those are all well and good, but there's much more attention given to the food and the fellowship, and probably much less to the reverence. And that's what was happening in the church. Is that rather than getting together and celebrating the goodness of God like we have done this morning and remembering what Jesus had done, many of them had turned their attention inward and were only worried about themselves. And so there in verse 2, Paul is calling them to remember. If you look back in chapter 11, verse 2, he tells them, I praise you because you remember me in everything and you hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered. They were remembering him and what he had taught them and done for them, but they were missing a vital part of their picture. And so today, God is calling us to do the same thing, that as we live in the busyness of our worlds, as each of us faces different struggles, whether they're financial struggles, whether they're family struggles, whatever it is that's corrupting our lives or co-opting our time, God says, don't forget me. Actively bring to mind what I have done for you. And in a few moments, as we take the bread and the cup, we'll do that. But I want you to see the second thing Paul says to them as he moves on in verse 17 through 22. He says, we can't forget his truth, and so the mercy of God allows us to review. That God could, in his justice, simply strike us down for not remembering. He could call us into account immediately for not remembering. But in verse 17, Paul says, in giving this instruction, I don't praise you because you've come together not for the better, but for the worse. He's catching their attention to review what they ought to be about. He says, in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. And in part, I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. He said, there have to be leaders, but there don't need to be factions. There don't need to be camps of this person and these people in that area and this person and these people in this area, and they're going different directions. He says, that's not at all what it's to be about. Because when you're getting together, it is more of the haves versus the have-nots. And he says, God's mercy is calling you to review what you're to be about, to compare yourselves to the traditions, to the truth, and to see when I'm coming together, when I'm gathering together with my church family, am I united in love? Let me tell you one of the neatest things that's happened to me as your pastor happened on Wednesday night. I'm standing right about there where that table sits right now. This past Wednesday night, we had a called business meeting. And if Baptists do cover dish well, we do business meetings pretty well too. We like to have business meetings. And you just never know what will happen in a business meeting. Amen? And this was a called business meeting. This wasn't a scheduled business. This was a called business meeting. Because we had an issue to deal with from Personnel Committee. And the Finance Committee decided that they needed to take action on an issue as well. Some of you who are here on a weekly basis can see our report each week about our attendance and what our offering has been like and how it compares to budget. And we are not bringing in as much money in tithes and offerings as we had anticipated we would. And so the Finance Committee said, this needs our attention. They have been paying attention for several months and praying that God would increase the giving, that He would motivate all those who come to give out of their want and to give out of their plenty, and that all of us together would help meet these budget needs. They said it's not happening. So here's what we proposed. And they proposed to the church that of a certain number of line items, and it was across the board in every area, whether it was missions or pastoral or education or youth or music or maintenance, every part of the budget. They said these particular areas need to be cut 40% of what's remaining. Well, it's never comfortable to talk about money. And it's really never comfortable to talk about money in the church when everybody's affected. But you know what happened in that meeting Wednesday night? Everybody in this room, there were about 75 or 80 for a called business meeting. That was miracle number one, is that we had a good number. But everybody in this room began to say, Brother David, this is the right thing. Finance Committee has done the right thing. And this is uncomfortable. And we'd rather it be some way else, but how do we make this work? They talked and discussed, and we came to a conclusion together, and we even made an amendment to the motion that most everybody figured out eventually because we had to amend it on the fly, and that was rather interesting. Pam will have the notes for you, and I'm sure that'll be great. But then they all voted and said, yes, this is what we have to do. That we're going to cut this. But the greatest thing that happened, after we said amen and we adjourned the meeting, people stayed in the room, talking. There was a group right back in that area back there close to where Linda Whitley is. They were cackling, laughing. I didn't know what was happening. I was down here talking to somebody and heard this laughter, and all across the room there were hugs and handshakes, and people lingered because the Spirit of God was at work in this room. That's how you know God's at work. Is when people will wrestle with hard things and will say, how do we do this together? It's not perfect. I may not be comfortable, but we're doing this together. And Paul said, that's what I want in your church. And that's what God is saying now is, that's what I want in your church, is that there is this unity, that there is this love for one another that says you may have or you may have not, but collectively together, we serve the Lord.